Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever just stopped and thought, maybe looking up at the sky or, even just looking at your own hand and asked, why is any of this here? Why isn't there just, nothing? It's that huge, ancient question, why is there anything at all? And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're always looking for causes, right? Explanations. But what happens when you push that back? Looking for the ultimate cause, the very first domino.
And that's precisely where this really crucial idea of necessary existence enters the picture. We're exploring the concept of what philosophers call a necessary being.
Okay.
So think of it like this. It's something that's concrete, meaning it's not just an idea. It can actually do something, cause things.
Right. Tangible in some sense?
Exactly. And the really key part is it's something that has to exist. It exists no matter what. It literally cannot not exist.
Wow. So it's not just about what is, but what must be.
That's it. It's about necessity.
So today, we're really going deep into this philosophical puzzle. We've gathered insights from, a whole range of arguments, counter-arguments, to help you get a handle on what a necessary being actually is. Why it's such a fundamental idea in metaphysics, thinking about reality itself, and also in theology.
Definitely.
And we'll explore the, frankly, surprising reasons philosophers have argued both for and against it.
And the scope here is just enormous. It touches on cosmogony, the origin of the universe.
Right.
Ontology, the study of existence itself. And it even gets into really radical questions like, could there have been absolutely nothing? This metaphysical nihilism.
Whoa.
Now, historically, arguments for a necessary being often laid the groundwork for arguments for God. But it's really, really important to be clear here.
Okay.
Necessary being isn't automatically God or supreme being in philosophy. Some thinkers imagine a necessary being in ways that are totally non-theistic. Maybe it's like a timeless condition that just has to be there for a cosmos to exist at all.
That's a crucial distinction. Something I found really fascinating in the material was this survey. Over 2,300 people, philosophers included, and it found that, get this, over 93% of those who said they didn't believe in a necessary being. Their answers on related questions were actually consistent with the premises used in arguments for one.
Wow, really? That's high.
Yeah. So even if they didn't consciously buy into the conclusion, their sort of background reasoning seemed to lean towards its possibility. It kind of hints at how deep these intuitions might run, maybe, even for skeptics.
That is interesting. It suggests the premises themselves have a strong pull.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How on earth do you even start arguing for something that must exist? Seems like a tall order. A common way in is something called the argument from contingency, right? Often called ACE.
That's a major one, yes, ACE. And it starts really simply, like dead simple. Something exists, look around you, there's stuff.
Okay, check. Stuff exists.
Right. Then it says, okay, anything that could have not existed. These are contingent things, like this table, or you, or me.
We didn't have to be here.
Exactly. Anything contingent needs an explanation for why it exists. Why is it here instead of not being here?
Makes sense. We ask why all the time.
We do. Now, the core claim of ACE, the real engine, is that this explanation can't just come from other contingent things endlessly. So an infinite chain A caused by B, B by C, forever back. Or a circle A causes B and B causes A that's not considered a sufficient explanation for the whole chain or circle existing in the first place.
Right. It explains the parts within the system, maybe, but not the system itself.
Precisely. So if every contingent thing needs an explanation, and that explanation can't ultimately be just more contingent things, well, the conclusion is there has to be a necessary foundation. Something that isn't contingent, something that explains the rest.
Okay. Those analogies in the source really help me with this internal explanation isn't enough idea, like the Eskimos on the street corner. If you ask why each one is there, and they all point to each other in a circle, or maybe an infinite line down the block, you still want to know, but why is this whole group here?
Right.
Why this gathering?
Exactly. Or the infinite snake analogy. If a snake is infinitely long and each part is held up by the part in front of it, you still have the question, why is there a snake here at all? Where did the whole infinite thing come from? The internal explanation doesn't satisfy the question about the totality.
Got it. That clarifies why the argument pushes beyond just contingent causes.
And the justification for that explanatory principle behind ACE, it comes from a few places. There's induction. We just observe that things do have causes and explanations in our experience.
Seems reasonable.
There's also what philosophers call a priori intuition. It just seems fundamentally right, a basic principle of reason, that contingent things require explanations.
Okay.
Plus, there's the argument from avoiding chaos. If things could just pop into existence uncaused, why don't we see, pianos or elephants just appearing out of thin air all the time?
Right. Good point.
It suggests there's a principle at work. And finally, it avoids making arbitrary distinctions. If this contingent thing needs an explanation, why wouldn't that one? Contingency itself seems to call for an explanation.
That lays out ACE pretty clearly. It seems quite forceful. But are there maybe arguments that try to reach a similar conclusion without making such strong claims? Like maybe not everything contingent needs a cause?
Yeah, that's a great question because ACE is strong. And yes, philosophers have developed arguments that are a bit more, let's say, modest. One key example is the modal argument from beginnings, or MA.
Modal argument from beginnings, MA, okay.
What's really interesting here is the shift. MA isn't so much focused on what actually is the case, but more on what could possibly be the case. It deals in possibility.
So possibilities rather than strict actualities. How does that work?
Well, instead of saying every contingent thing actually has a cause, MA relies on a weaker principle. It says something like, for any positive state of affairs like the sun is shining being true, if that state of affairs can begin to be true, it wasn't always true, it started, then it's possible for there to be something external to it that caused it to begin.
Only that it's possible there's an external cause, not that there must be one in every case.
Exactly. That's the weak causal principle, much less demanding than ACE's principle.
I see.
Then ME combines this with another premise. It seems plausible, maybe even obvious, that the state of affairs contingent concrete things exist could have had a beginning. It's not absurd to think the whole collection of contingent reality might have started at some point.
Right, that seems intuitive.
So if it's possible for things that can begin to have an external cause, and it's possible that contingent reality began, then MB argues towards a necessary foundation without needing ACE's stronger claims. It can allow for some uncaused contingent things, maybe even circular chains or infinite regresses, which ACE typically rejects.
That definitely sounds more flexible. It avoids some potential objections to ACE.
It does. It's a different path to a similar endpoint.
Okay, now for a completely different angle, one that was pretty surprising to me initially, the argument from necessary abstracta to necessary concreta. This involves things like numbers.
Yeah, this one's fascinating. It takes a less direct route. It starts with abstract objects.
Abstracta, like concepts, numbers, maybe mathematical truths?
Exactly. Premise one is basically, necessarily there are abstract objects. Think about 2 + 2 = 4.
Okay, true everywhere, always. Necessary truth.
Right. So the argument goes, for that truth to be necessary, it's about the number 2, the concept of addition, these abstract things must also exist necessarily. They can't not exist if the truth itself is necessary.
All right, so necessary abstract things exist, like numbers. Got it. What's next?
Premise 2. Necessarily, if there are abstract objects, then there must also be concrete objects.
Why? Why do abstract ideas need concrete things?
Well, the intuition is about grounding. How could these abstract things, like the number 2, exist totally disconnected from reality? Some views say they need concrete minds to think them, conceptualism, or concrete things in the world to be examples of them, like 2 chairs, Aristotelianism.
Okay.
Plus, there's an epistemic challenge. If abstract are totally separate and causally inert, how could we as concrete beings ever know about them? There needs to be some connection, some grounding in the concrete world we inhabit.
That makes sense. Like they need an anchor in reality.
Sort of, yeah. Then, premise 3, possibly there are no contingent concrete objects.
Wait, so it's possible that no things like tables or planets or us exist?
That's the idea. It challenges the feeling that something contingent must always exist. The thought experiment often used is the subtraction argument. Imagine you have a world with, say, 10 contingent things. You can imagine subtracting 1, right?
Yeah.
Then another, until you reach 0. If you can conceptually subtract all contingent things, it suggests a world with no contingent concrete things is possible.
Okay, I can follow that logic conceptually.
So put it together. If abstracta exist necessarily, premise 1, and they necessarily require some concreta to exist, premise 2, but it's possible for there to be no contingent concreta, premise 3.
Then the concrete things required by the abstracta can't be contingent. They must be necessary concrete things.
You got it. It's a clever, if complex, route to concluding there must be necessary concrete beings.
Wow. Okay. And you mentioned one more briefly, the Gödelian one.
Ah, yes, the argument from perfections, linked to Kurt Gödel. It's highly technical, very logical. It essentially defines certain properties like necessary existence itself or being capable of causing things as positive properties or perfections.
Right.
Then, using sophisticated modal logic, it argues that these positive properties must be compatible and ultimately must all be possessed by some existing being. This often leads towards a being with maximal perfections, closely resembling the classical concept of God. It's a whole other deep dive, really.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, so we've seen some powerful arguments for a necessary being, but this wouldn't be a deep dive without looking at the other side. What are the main challenges, the big objections?
Absolutely. Let's turn to the critiques. A classic one comes from the philosopher David Hume, his conceivability argument.
Hume. Okay, what was his point?
Hume's famous line is basically, whatever we can conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. So his argument is, if you can clearly imagine or conceive of a necessary being existing, well, you can also clearly conceive of that same being not existing. You can imagine a world without it.
Right.
But if you can conceive of it not existing, then it can't be truly necessary.
Okay.
Because a necessary being, by definition, is one whose non-existence is impossible. If non-existence is conceivable, it's possible, therefore it's not necessary.
Okay, that sounds quite damaging.
Yeah.
If I can imagine it gone, it wasn't necessary. But hold on. You mentioned a parity problem earlier. Does that apply here? Isn't Hume's argument a bit of a double-edged sword?
Exactly. That's the standard reply to the parity problem. You hit the nail on the head. Just as someone might say, I can conceive of a world with no necessary being, therefore it's possible there isn't one. Someone else can say, I can conceive of a situation that implies a necessary being must exist, like a situation where every contingent fact has an explanation. If conceiving implies possibility, then both sides seem to have conceivable scenarios.
So conceivability supports both the possibility of no necessary being and the possibility of a necessary being.
Pretty much. The evidence from conceivability seems to cut both ways, leaving things awash, as philosophers sometimes say. Doesn't seem to definitively settle the issue on its own.
Okay, that makes sense. What about that subtraction argument you mentioned? It was used for the abstract argument, but you said it's also used again.
That's right. It gets used by both sides. When used against necessary existence, the argument is straightforward. Imagine concrete things. Can you imagine one less? Yes. Can you keep doing that until you imagine none?
Yeah, conceptually seems like it.
If you can conceive of a possible world with absolutely zero concrete things, then it follows that no concrete thing exists necessarily. If it were necessary, it would have to exist even in that empty world, which is a contradiction.
Okay, so the argument is, empty world is conceivable, therefore possible, therefore no necessary concrete things.
That's the gist. But again, parity strikes back.
How so this time?
Well, opponents argue you can construct a parallel argument, maybe based on the need for explanation. You can argue that it's impossible for there to have been nothing concrete. You can try to build a case that a state of no concrete things is actually inconceivable or impossible for other reasons, maybe related to the principle of sufficient reason or something similar.
So again, similar styles of argument pointing in opposite directions.
Exactly. Both the subtraction argument for an empty world and arguments against an empty world rely on certain modal intuitions or principles, and it's not immediately obvious which set of intuitions or principles we should trust more.
It really highlights how much depends on your starting assumptions. Okay, what about the costly addition objection? That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, this one is more about theoretical elegance, you could say. The argument is that postulating a necessary being makes your overall picture of reality, your ontology, more complicated than it needs to be.
How is it more complicated?
It introduces what the critics call anomalies. First, modal anomalies. You now have two fundamentally different kinds of things, contingent things that could exist or not, and necessary things that must exist. A universe with only contingent things seems simpler, more uniform in its modality.
Okay, one kind of existence instead of two.
Right. And second, causal anomalies. You have things that need causes, contingent ones presumably, and one thing, the necessary being, that doesn't have a cause and might even be an uncaused cause. Again, a universe where everything follows the same causal rules seems simpler.
So the argument is, contingent-only universe, simpler, therefore better.
That's the core idea. Why add this extra unusual category of necessary being if you don't absolutely have to? It's a kind of Occam's razor argument applied to metaphysics.
But, hang on. You mentioned earlier, didn't you, that some things seem necessary anyway, like facts or maybe mathematical truths. If necessary abstract things exist, doesn't that mean we already have modal anomalies?
Excellent point. That's a key part of the reply. The counter-argument is that these so-called modal anomalies might be unavoidable. If you accept that any necessary truths exist, like 2 plus 2 or 3 or even the two truths exist, then you already have both necessary and contingent modes of existence in your ontology.
Right. So the anomaly isn't introduced by a necessary concrete being, it's already there.
Exactly. The jump isn't from uniformity to anomaly, it's potentially just adding another type of necessary thing, a concrete one, alongside the abstract ones we might already be committed to. Why should that be particularly surprising or costly? And furthermore, the reply goes, the supposedly simpler, contingent-only universe leaves its own deep mysteries. Like, why does this whole collection of contingent stuff exist? Why is there anything contingent rather than nothing? The contingentist view might struggle to provide a final explanation for the totality of contingent reality itself.
Whereas the necessary being presumably provides that final explanation, or is that final explanation?
Precisely. It offers a potential explanatory endpoint that the contingent-only view might lack, so the cost of adding a necessary being might be offset by the explanatory benefit it provides.
So wrapping this all up, we've journeyed through some really deep waters here. What's the main takeaway for someone trying to grapple with these huge questions about reality?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a genuinely complex and ongoing debate. There are really sophisticated, well-thought-out arguments on both sides. We saw those parity problems crop up repeatedly.
Yeah, definitely.
Whereas similar reasoning styles seem to lead to opposite conclusions. That really underscores how crucial it is to be aware of your own starting points, your own intuitions, and the underlying logical principles, like those from modal logic, S5 axioms, and so on, that often power these arguments. There aren't easy knockdown answers here.
Right. So you've essentially just navigated centuries of intense philosophical thinking, hopefully gaining some real clarity on these profound questions about existence itself. You're now kind of equipped with the core arguments, the counter-arguments, the main lines of thought for and against this idea of a necessary being.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. The very fact that these arguments persist, that brilliant minds continue to explore them from all angles, suggests that fundamental question, why is there anything at all, isn't just some idle speculation. It's deep, it's persistent. It kind of invites you personally to reflect. What do your intuitions tell you? What makes the most sense to you about what must be, or maybe what could have been?
That's a great question to ponder. We hope this deep dive has shed some light on this fascinating and frankly fundamental philosophical territory. Thanks for joining us.